This is the 21.5 Show.
You're on 121.5, the emergency frequency.
Whether you're a professional pilot or want to be one, you're in the right place.
Let's get started.
Join professional aviators Dylan and Max as they talk their experience in the airlines, business aviation, and more.
Life is good.
Industry experts, unique stories, and plenty of fun. This is the 21.5 Show.
Here we go.
All right, Dylan. Listeners, welcome back to the show. Today, we are going to be talking about pilot mental health, the dirty secret of the pilot business, but that's fortunately gaining some momentum in recent months because of things in the news and people like our guest on the show that are actually doing something about it.
Yeah, Brian is kind of leading the charge here with the organization of the campaign, the Pilot Mental Health Campaign. And, I think it's been a topic for a long time where folks have known there's an issue, but there's sort of been frustration because we don't know, well, what do we do about it? How do we organize? And so we're excited to chat with Brian about this topic. Max, in your best YouTuber voice, can you just tell everyone, let's jump right into it?
What's up, guys? We're going to jump right into this interview. Make sure you smash that like button, subscribe, rate. Here he is, our boy Brian.
All right, Max, we're so excited to be joined by Brian Bomhoff. He's the founder and executive director of the Pilot Mental Health Campaign. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Brian, listeners of our show will remember that we've had some folks on before to discuss what's going on in the pilot mental health arena. Maddie and Emma have been on the show to talk about petitions in the past and all of the work that they're doing on the Pilots Pandemic podcast. And then sort of out of that and other things, the Pilot Mental Health Campaign has kind of taken shape. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is and what you guys are trying to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, interesting story. I started listening to the Pilots Pandemic podcast, and then I reached out to Emma and Maddie, and we started talking. And I thought we should probably have a new advocacy organization around this specific issue. So earlier last year, in 2023, we launched the Pilot Mental Health Campaign. We are the first nationwide nonprofit advocacy organization dedicated specifically to improving FAA regulations as they relate to mental health. We think that that's a big issue that has gone unaddressed for many decades. And we think it's time that policymakers, pilots, the aviation community takes a serious look at what the current system is doing and how we can improve it.
Yeah, for a long time, the conversation was like, wow, there's so much that needed to be done in mental health. Where do we even start? And so we started to talk about it on podcasts and we started to try and sign petitions, but it just seemed like, man, it's such a daunting task. So what have you guys learned as how do you approach this? How do you get the conversation going and actually implement real change?
Yeah, absolutely. So the conversations that have been taking place over the last few years have been absolutely critical. I mean, the segments that you've had on your podcast that others have had, those are very important first steps. So my background a little bit, I'm a pilot. I have a PPL, my private license, not a commercial pilot, but I know a little bit about the system because when I was getting my license, when I was in high school, I went through some normal, emotional teenage things and did see a therapist and got treatment. And it was then that I realized that this system is really not user-friendly to anyone who does that. And a few years ago, I was looking to get back into aviation because I've been out of it for a few years. And I kind of assumed that over the 10 years or so that had passed, the regulations had changed a bit. They implemented the SSRI program. I was very curious about that. And the more I dug, the more disheartened I became. And the more stories I heard that were discouraging and sounded very similar to how things were 10, 20 years ago. So my background after college, I worked as a political organizer, a communications consultant, and also a fundraising consultant, mostly in state politics here in Washington, but also work in California, Arizona, Idaho, and quite a bit of work at the federal level as well. So what I think we're lacking is a coherent voice specifically around this one issue that has policy advocacy and goals in mind. and that is set up professionally enough so that we can gain support and input from other stakeholders in this space, other people like Dr. William Hoffman. There's so many great researchers out there. We need to all combine our efforts into one organization, one voice, and speak directly to members of Congress. And I think that is what we bring to the table that is probably a little bit different than what's happened in the past. The change.org petition that Maddie and Emma put together is fantastic. That was of interest to people on Capitol Hill when we went there and spoke with them last month. But a political organization that is capable of speaking directly to politicians on the terms that they understand. And that's what we bring to the table, and I'm happy to talk more about that.
Yeah, you mentioned Capitol Hill visit. I think that was one of the first real tangible signs that we saw that progress is being made. You guys were invited to speak. The NTSB gathered folks to talk about the topic. So that was about a month ago, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So we were very lucky to have the privilege to be invited to talk at the NTSB roundtable on mental health, National Transportation Safety Board. I'm sure most of your listeners know. Very esteemed organization, small organization, but it's the one charged with investigating all of the accidents that happen in aviation and other transport sectors. And the chair of the NTSB is currently a woman named Jennifer Homendy. She is very well respected in her field. And so many people are discouraged by the conversations that we've had over the years because they seem to start and then stop and then start and then stop. The FAA had an aviation rulemaking committee in 2015. It made a few recommendations, but they were minor and it didn't really go anywhere. The one takeaway that I found most interesting from the NTSB event was the tone with which the NTSB was disagreeing with the FAA's current stance around mental health. Jennifer Homendy said in one of her opening remarks, and this is a direct quote, "No one should have to think twice about their job before seeking help." So they get it. The chair of the NTSB gets it. The vice chair gets it. I would encourage everyone listening to go on YouTube, Google NTSB mental health event, watch the sessions. So there were 3 sessions. The first one was firsthand accounts of the system. We had 2 board members of ours that presented testimony during that segment. Anne Suh, who is the mother of John Hauser, who unfortunately passed away. He was a UND student who took his own life after coming to the conclusion that the FAA regulations were too prohibitive for him to seek care. And that was one of the things that actually got me really fired up and got me to start this organization. I don't care so much about what happens to my license or medical anymore, but the stories that like that I hear are just infuriating and heartbreaking. And I would compel your listeners to at least watch that segment from the NTSB event. Lila Stein is also a board member of ours, and she presented from the college student perspective. I was at the Middle Tennessee State University Symposium on Mental Health in October, and great research. I mean, I'm very impressed with Generation Z and, their interest in this topic. There's such a generational divide, which we can talk about later. But I was also saddened because I also sat in on some panels where students clearly wanted to be more vocal, but they couldn't bring themselves to talk openly in the way that I'm used to. I mean, they were asking questions like, what is the difference between counseling and therapy? What is reportable? What isn't? Just like walking on thin ice. And no young person, no professional, no pilot should ever have to be in that position. And I think the leadership at the NTSB gets that. So I was actually very, very heartened by the event.
Wow. When they brought together these different witnesses and speakers, they shared some of the problems, right? Like where things are at now. And then was there any talk about next steps or like what can we do to fix this? Or
And kind of what was the FAA's?
Yeah.
You framed really well about how the NTSB views this, but what was the FAA's stance? That gathering was a little different.
Yeah, so the FAA sent Dr. Penny Giovanetti. She is the lead on aerospace specialties in the Office of Aeromedicine. So all mental health special issuances and regulations related to that fall somewhat under her authority. It's still a little vague to us exactly what falls under whose authority within the FAA.
Imagine that.
Yeah, but she was tasked with sort of at least presenting the FAA's view and my personal opinion that there is no cohesive argument that they made that supported their current standards. In fact, one of the major takeaways was there really is no body of medical or scientific evidence that justifies keeping people with mild symptoms that are well managed out of the cockpit. I mean, that evidence just doesn't exist. Now, if you're talking about medications, especially when you're starting medications and you don't know side effects, that's certainly a different conversation. And then, yeah, I was disappointed, but I understand that the position she's put in, they're very defensive on this issue. They haven't changed their talking points very much in the last year, really. I think they are, we'll get into the aviation rulemaking committee that was announced, but they're kind of staying the course for now.
What do you think about like some of the events that have happened lately? One that comes to mind is the Alaska Airlines jump seater, right? And that guy, assumably, I guess we don't know, as hasn't been put out there in a concrete fashion, but that he may have struggled with mental health or at least some short-term depression, things like that. And then something big happens like that that's all over the news and really brings focus to people all over, not just pilots, but passengers, I guess you could say, right? Is that good for the cause? Is it bad? Like, what effect does that have? And how do you guys either capitalize or how do you guys manage that?
It's both good and bad. On the good side of things, I think this is one of the things that prompted the NTSB to launch their roundtable on mental health at the time that they did. And you and your listeners are well aware of what the negatives are. I mean, a small Cessna lands in a golf course and it's primetime news. They don't talk about all the shooting deaths, the car crashes. People are very interested and particularly afraid of aviation. It is something that we have to navigate carefully. Luckily, it turned out well. No one was injured. Procedures held up. The checks and balances that they have in place worked. And he was able to eventually get the care that he needed. And I guess I'll go a little bit back. So I know not too much, but a little bit about this. So he was apparently suffering from untreated depression for quite some time. And he had lost one of his close friends recently, felt like he couldn't get help, felt like he needed treatment. And the mushrooms, the psilocybin that he took, that was apparently supposed to be part of a healing process to help with the loss of his friend. And that's actually not that unusual in that space. It's obviously illegal, but I mean, that's a growing area of science and medicine, actually. But it can cause extremely serious side effects, and he should not have been on that plane at that time. So I think in my conversations with stakeholders, journalists, I've been relatively pleased with the reaction because I'm hearing a lot of empathy. I mean, a lot of people, they hear that story and they're like, how could he possibly have gotten to that point? And well, if you're in this industry, you know very well how you would have gotten to that point. When Anne Sue went to her son's dorm room to clean out his belongings after he passed away, the first thing that her son's roommate's father said to her was, "This is an industry-wide problem," before even introducing himself. He just said, "This is an industry-wide problem," while crying. So he shouldn't have done what he did, but it's hard to blame him for trying to help himself in that scenario. I just wish he had gotten help in a more professional manner.
It's the dirty secret of this business. And it's unfortunate because in some instances, we've come so far. Like the HIMSS program we talk about is such a powerful thing for people that have a problem that then can get treatment, don't feel like they have to hide it. And they know they're going to be out of the cockpit maybe for a period of time, but there's a path back. And that's what we really need. Like, yeah, you know, and the FAA, if their stance is that they're protecting the public, it's almost quite the opposite, is that people are forced to fly untreated, and which is worse. Pilots, especially airline pilots, aren't afraid to step back for a period of time to get treatment. They just have to know that there's light at the end of the tunnel and a path back to work and back to the cockpit. That program, I feel like, draws a lot of parallels to this, where if you need help, you should be able to get help. And that program, if you look on the surface, it seems like such a great deal and everything. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And it's not like, okay, you're fixed. get back to the cockpit. It is not like that. It is very ongoing and intensive. It's a big commitment, and it's a lot of meetings and a lot of follow-up, and there's a lot to it. And that's what this needs, is some sort of accountability and long-term plan. And Brian, it's very easy for all of us to say, yes, this is such a problem. We'll sign the petition, no problem. But the fact that you stepped up, created an organization, and actually have the skill set to take it somewhere is very inspiring. So thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I'm more inspired by the people I've met during this process who have been working on this far longer than I have. This is a special moment. And I think one of my main takeaways that I'd like your audience to understand is that this is not like 2015 again. This is not 2018. I think we actually do have momentum coming out of the NTSB event. And it's not just the NTSB event, it's the increased media coverage. And there were certainly some hit pieces recently, having to do with the Alaska Airlines incident. But there have also been more deep dives into this issue than I think there have been in recent history. And that's encouraging. Many of our board members, 4 of them actually, participated in that Washington Post article on this that actually, I think, took a fairly progressive, holistic view of the issue, because it's so easy to just say, no one wants a crazy pilot, which no one does. But the overwhelming majority of people who seek care pose no threat to safety.
You can definitely tell that there's finally some momentum building up here in this for a broad perspective. And I think that it's going to take somebody like you to capitalize on that momentum to bring it across the finish line, because instituting change, there's a way to do that. And there's a game that has to be played that not a lot of us, especially pilots, we don't know how to play that game.
Well, the other thing that you mentioned too, Brian, that's I think is interesting is you said, Generation Z is taking a lot of leadership in this area. It seems like we're in the middle of a generational change in pilots in general, right? We have a lot of the Vietnam veterans that are all retiring at this point now, and sort of like Gen Zs or the millennials are sort of now going to be on the top of the seniority list, who I think are much more open to this, and then Gen Z even more. So have you noticed that sort of just like as time progresses, like more and more of the pilots realize that this is an issue?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is definitely a cultural generational divide. And it's obviously not true for everyone. There are plenty of young people who are more traditional in their approach, and there are plenty of flying octogenarians who would love to change these policies.
Yep.
But yeah, to answer your question, there's a stark gap between sort of Gen Z, millennial, and baby boomers and older generations, not just on aviation mental health, but obviously mental health in general. I mean, so many of kids these days grew up in an environment that was even different than what I grew up in. I'm in my mid-30s. And the conversation was advanced to the point where seeking counseling was considered good. Seeking therapy is considered a healthy preventative tactic for mental health. And you see that, and then these young people, they get into their flight schools, and all of a sudden they realize, wait a minute, that therapy I did for a couple years after my mom died, I have to report that because why? Or it's like a small course of antidepressants. ADHD is a big issue right now. They're particularly strict on ADHD. Some countries are more lenient on that front. There's a big generational gap, and it won't stand with the current system. It just won't work with the new generation of pilots.
Yeah. Let's take a break from the show to tell you about Timothy P. Pope. He's a certified financial planner dedicated to guiding professional pilots through smart financial planning. Whether it's saving for retirement, investment management, a seamless military transition, or strategic tax planning, Tim is your trusted financial partner. Join Tim as he leads engaging discussions on personal finance strategies for professional pilots on the Pilot Money podcast. Timothy P. Pope, helping professional pilots make the most out of life. All right, back to the show. Anything else from the roundtable? Any other thoughts or takeaways that you had?
Where were things left when it was all said and done?
There were 3 panels. There was the share your story in the beginning, which I think was the one that was most heart-wrenching. It's the one you should watch. Then there was the medical expert opinions in the middle. And then at the end was the roundtable that I participated on. And that was a big group of about 30 people. And we spoke about what is the path forward. There are many differing opinions. I think one thing, the main takeaway is that we can no longer pretend that this isn't a problem. We can no longer sweep this under the rug. I think There's advances to be made on peer support. That was something that came up several times. I've heard differing opinions on peer support. Some people love it, and some people probably wouldn't be comfortable actually talking to a peer about their mental health. Therapies that work for different people need to be part of the system. So I'm glad that we have peer support as an option. But we did actually talk about, what needs to be done in terms of medical evidence, what research needs to be done in order to help us move to a new place. And so I think there's growing consensus on that. The vice chair of the NTSB brought up the potential of maybe using a NASA-style database for anonymous reporting, because we need to gather data on this issue. Because, you can imagine, like Dr. Hoffman tried to get a study approved that put pilots with depression in a simulator to sort of test, does it actually matter? And not many people signed up.
Yeah, imagine that.
Yeah, we have some hurdles to overcome, but I think the main takeaways were action does need to happen and the conversation needs to continue.
So what, from your perspective, is the mechanism of change here? Like, what has to happen for there to be change that's instituted that's meaningful?
Yeah, so there are several ways that this could go, and I'll just tell you what the government is currently up to. So the day before the NTSB event, the FAA announced a aviation rulemaking committee on mental health standards that is currently being put together. I believe it's scheduled to wrap up by March 31st. And they are tasked with making recommendations to improve the barriers to access around mental health care. And they are also tasked with potentially making recommendations for regulatory changes. So this is the ARC, Aviation Rulemaking Committee. This is the same sort of organization that the FAA put in place in 2015, 2016, after the Germanwings incident that looked into pilot mental fitness standards. And so it's a very similar organization to that. I was kind of surprised with the timeline on that. Usually these things go a bit longer, but this one was launched in November and it's wrapping up in March. So it wouldn't surprise me if there are quite a few stakeholders within the FAA who actually already have opinions on what they might want to change. And if you listen to their public appearances over the last year or two, they kind of drop those every now and then. They do want to minimize their wait list. They do want to add a few more medications. They're always dodgy on that issue, though. But I think the ARC is going to come to some conclusions in the near term that maybe add a few more medications, maybe make some regulatory changes. But I don't have enough information yet to say whether or not it's actually going to be substantive. So yeah, that's something we're paying very close attention to. And it's also not the only thing going on. So
everyone on the committee, is it internal to the FAA or do they have external folks on that committee? Do you know?
I believe it's both. We don't actually have a membership list at the moment. I do believe that will be released publicly soon, is my understanding, because I know they're meeting this month in person. The membership was chosen by, I think it's the Deputy Administrator for Aviation Safety. I'd have to check on that. But he's charged with selecting the membership of the board. It does include internal stakeholders, but it also includes some external stakeholders as well.
Okay.
And then in addition to the ARC, there's also the FAA reauthorization, which was introduced last year, 2023, and got close to passage. It has a House version and a Senate version. Both versions of those bills have sections on aeromedical items and aeromedical mental health. So they both have working groups that are dedicated to, they're tasked with looking at this issue and, similar to the ARC, coming to conclusions and recommendations. And I believe in the legislation as it's currently written, the FAA administrator is tasked with putting that group together. So it's a little confusing because there's legislation in the reauth, and then there's also the FAA ARC, which kind of overlap.
So what's the timeline on reauthorization?
Was supposed to pass in September, then was supposed to pass in December, is now supposed to pass in March. I think it actually will. That's my personal guess because it's an election year and they want to wrap it up. But I could be wrong. They might just push it again.
Have you read what's in that? Are you guys aware? And what's your sense on that?
Yeah, very aware. We're actually in conversations with the Senate Commerce Committee on making a few recommendations about how it might be improved. It assembles a work group. Our main concern is it's a little vague on what the work group is tasked to do. It does mention specifics like, look at international comparisons, look at the ADHD standards, compare them to modern medical standards. The word modern and modernization is in there, which is a good sign, but it's also fairly vague and doesn't actually require the working group to come to hard conclusions that could be immediately turned into policy or law, though those certainly could come from that working group.
Your plan of action, PMHC's plan of action for 2024, can you get into maybe your 3 highest priorities?
So because this is a very dynamic situation, more dynamic than we were expecting it to be when we launched, we have a multi-front strategy on this issue that hits each and every one of potential paths forward. So we are looking to influence the Aviation Rulemaking Committee in whatever capacity we can. That will include providing them reports directly from us to help educate them on the things that pilots are concerned about, some things that we are concerned about. We have reached out to the FAA a few times. We have so far been rebuffed. They are, of course, very busy, but they might also not be interested in speaking with us for political reasons. I don't know. As for the working group that is in the reauthorization, we are in contact with the staff members who are writing that in both the House and the Senate. And I think there's opportunity to make some tweaks, though I don't know. I mean, it's pretty put together already. I mean, it was basically ready to go in August, September. They got caught on a few non-related issues like the 1,500-hour rule that you're all familiar with, more contentious issues. But we are also looking to influence that to whatever capacity we can. But the main thing that I would say is that we're doing direct legislative advocacy, and that means reaching out directly to members of Congress. So after the NTSB event on the 6th, we had about 12 meetings with members of Congress and their staff on the Hill. And I wanted to do this because I always believed from the beginning that they hear from organizations. They hear from ALPA about this. They hear from AOPA about this. They hear from NBAA about this. But every lobbyist organization has their own unique needs, as I'm sure your listeners are very well aware. And sometimes the issue of mental health, because it's kind of sensitive for a lot of people, it gets pushed to the back of the line on the priorities. They all have higher priorities. And so our organization is the only one reaching out to members of Congress directly saying pilot mental health matters. And in our first batch of meetings, I was actually encouraged because it seemed like there were a lot of people who didn't understand the regulations as they currently are. That's going to be a hurdle for us, is educating members of Congress and their staff, because it's so opaque. It is going to be a heavy lift, but we can do that. And we will provide briefing documents for them that directly address the current system and rebuff FAA talking points. We will be able to provide that to them and brief them on them so that they actually know what's going on. But more importantly, I want to get the pilots' perspectives in there. I mean, I want them to hear personal stories. People think that, and to some extent they're right, that Congress is broken and that they don't care and that's, it's a messy system. But the majority of people get into government for the right reasons. That is my experience. Things happen to them along the way sometimes, but most of them are there because they do want to make a positive impact. And I think this issue, from what we've found out so far, is relatively bipartisan. It doesn't seem to break along traditional lines. And it's not the most controversial in that, do you want your pilot to be safe and healthy? Yeah. Do you want your pilot to be mentally fit?
Can't be that tough of a sell.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's nice that you're coming from without, like you mentioned, the ties of other advocacy groups that have many different things that they're trying to promote or get. There's not it doesn't seem like there's a big financial interest that you have.
Yeah, we're an all volunteer staff, so we have consultants, but no, we're in it for the mission on this one. That is something to note. We have no baggage, we have no overhead or rent. Everything goes directly to this effort. I applaud the other organizations because they have been working on this issue in the background. They just don't want to be as public. They're being more public now than they have been in the past, though. And I think that's a good thing.
Right. Well, I'm sure you'll find some success, and then all of a sudden everyone will rush to meet you when you've done all the hard work, as it usually seems like it works out.
That's the idea.
Brian, I have a question. As you guys have started to speak to some of our elected officials, members of Congress, are there any particular members of Congress where you're finding traction, where they're getting it and they're like, oh yeah, is there anyone that our listeners should be aware of that like maybe they could email and encourage or reach out to and say, hey, I support what you're doing or anything like that you can share?
Yeah. So our initial area of focus would be the House Transportation Committee and the Aviation Subcommittee. Chair of the Aviation Subcommittee is Garrett Graves in Louisiana. Chair is Sam Graves. I don't actually know if they're related. I should know that. Sam Graves is great. He was one of the major sources behind Basic Med back in 2016. So he's a pilot himself, cares a lot about aviators, and he's the chair of the Transportation Committee, which is great. Chairs don't usually introduce legislation, but that's an office I would definitely consider reaching out to. And eventually, within the next couple of weeks, actually, we're going to have tools on our website to allow people to do that directly from our website.
Oh, cool.
So, yeah,
cool.
It'll save them the trouble of figuring that out. Let's see. In the Senate, Senator Cantwell is the chair. I had the privilege of having a meeting with her last summer about this issue. That meeting went well, but as I was expecting, most people who aren't in aviation don't know about this issue. And so she had a lot of questions, and there is going to be a tendency for members of Congress to push this to the FAA because they just don't understand it.
Don't understand,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's our job to educate and keep them on task and make them aware of how important this is. Other members of the Senate Commerce, I think it's Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Kirsten Sinema in Arizona. She's great. If you're in Arizona, like you guys, reach out to her.
Yeah. Shout out.
Mark Kelly's also a pilot, so that's another office.
And astronaut.
Yeah, that too. Arizona has a pretty good contingent when it comes to being influential on Capitol Hill because of the bipartisan nature of the state. Texas, Ted Cruz is the ranking member on the Senate committee. So reaching out to his office, other members, Klobuchar, anyone on that Senate committee. And then I would also say, and this is pretty important, reach out to your own member too, because they do care. I used to be an intern in a congressional office a lifetime ago, and they do actually write down everything you say. If you call, it is forwarded to DC. They do read it, whether or not it makes it to the congressperson. That's another issue, but they respond to well thought out, well-reasoned arguments. So keep that in mind, that your stuff actually is read. Form letters, they don't get through as much, but like a real personal story, an email or a letter, or even a phone call is great. There's always someone to take your calls. I would encourage you to reach out to your local member of Congress and tell them how you feel on this issue, because it does actually get through.
Wow.
That's good to know.
It is good to know.
That's
I didn't even know you could just call, like someone would answer.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah, you can call the DC office. All of them have district offices as well, locally to you. You can request a meeting with your member. Every now and then people will get lucky and you'll actually get a meeting. Some of your listeners might be, I don't know, chairs of pilot organizations or something like that. Those people are probably
very
more likely.
influential podcast hosts, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah. Give them a call, introduce yourself, say who you are, and tell them you want to share your opinions. And PMHC will have specific asks once we know exactly what the legislation is going to look like. And then one thing that I did forget about, Representative Sean Casten in Illinois is in the beginning process of actually drafting a bill to address this issue. And he's the first one. So I just want to say a personal thank you to Congressman Casten.
Wow.
It's great.
Well, Brian, what else can we do besides contacting members of Congress and your local representatives to support your organization and what you guys are doing?
So our next steps, we have sort of a four-pronged strategy. We have legislative advocacy, which is what I just mentioned. We have grassroots mobilization, regulatory outreach, speaking directly with the FAA, and public education. And we need help on all four fronts. So the easiest way for you to get involved right now is to go to pmhc.org, sign up for our emails, sign up as a volunteer. We're looking for all kinds of volunteers, whether you have a few hours or you want to be on our board of directors or our board of advisors. We have a medical advisory board. We have an aviation legal advisory board. We have a media advisory board if you want to join. So these are all options. This is a growing movement, and we need as many people as we can get. I will say over the next few months, this is going to be a particularly critical time, I think, because there are so many moving parts. So our ability to shape the narrative in the next 60 to 90 days, there's a window of opportunity there that won't close permanently, but I think it's richer now than it might be later, especially once the people's re-elections start getting fired up. And I'll say, if you happen to be at the Opelika Regional Forum that MBAA is having in Miami, we'll be at that. If you're at the Alaska Air Carrier Association in Anchorage, I'll be at that. The NGPA, National Gay Pilots Association in Palm Springs in mid-February, we'll be at that. We'll be at Oshkosh, we'll be at Sun and Fun. And then most importantly, we are planning a direct advocacy day on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. That is tentatively scheduled to be in March. But if you go to pmhc.org and sign up as a volunteer and just click that box that you're interested, we would love to have you join us in Washington, D.C. We'll do all the back end work. We arrange the meetings with members of Congress. All you do is show up, share your experience, share your story. So if people would be willing to do that, we'd love to have you.
And how is this organization funded, Brian? I mean, you guys are volunteers, but someone's got to buy plane tickets and booths and things like that.
Yep. So we're a grassroots organization. We have everything from large donors to small donors. Just because I mentioned all the things that we're going to, that doesn't mean that we don't need more funding, because every extra dollar, and having worked in fundraising over the years, you can really see it. I mean, if you get more donations, you just expand your campaign. You just expand the ad buy. You just expand your email list. And it really is driven by money and interest in volunteer support, which our volunteers are fantastic. They're really great. I mean, compared to a lot of nonprofits I've worked with in the past, I mean, our engagement levels are nothing like I've seen. So we have a lot to invest in, but I will say we are worth investing in. So we're the only organization that is tackling this one specific issue. We are organized more like a campaign than a nonprofit per se. I don't necessarily see PMHC being around in 2 to 3 years, or if it is, it'll maybe merge with or transition into a more traditional nonprofit. But our main goal is really, the next 3, 6 months, a year, and we do need funding, and anything you can do helps. I mean, if it is $1 a month, that absolutely does make a difference. If it's $100 a month, that's even better. And there is no maximum contribution limit for 501c4. Our donors are not reportable to the FEC because we do not give our money to politicians directly, though we do pay for lobbying. And that's why we're a C4 rather than a C3. So I can just say C4 means that your donation is not tax deductible, unfortunately. That allows us the freedom to do things like lobby Congress directly in a way that a more traditional nonprofit might not.
And then you don't end up getting text messages from Nikki Haley 900 times, right?
You'll get those no matter what you do, day and night.
They're very good. They're very highly funded. Well, that's it, you cheap pilots that have all gotten massive raises
That's
in the last
right.
couple of years. Put your money where your mouth is. Sign up for the email. Reach out to your members, your elected representatives, and make a donation. So how do we make a donation? On your website?
Yeah, it's pmhc.org/donate. You can also write a check, mail it to PMHC, P.O. Box 21961, Seattle, Washington, 98111. And if you are interested, if you have questions, if you're curious, if you want more information, we have briefing documents. I'm happy to provide those to you. Info@pmhc.org. Any questions you have, and our phone number is on the website as well. And I really can't emphasize enough. In the next 1 to 3 months, every extra dollar we bring in, it really is going to make a difference. Because
all right. Well, Brian, we will put our money where our mouth is. The
Yes.
21.5 podcast will be making a donation.
Absolutely.
So
thank
the rest
you.
of you step up.
That's right. And we encourage our listeners to join us. Brian, anytime this platform is available to you, if there are additional calls to action, please let us know. As you said, the next few months are critical.
Yeah. And we'd love to get an update as things move in the right direction here, hopefully.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And thank you so much for the opportunity. I mean, things like this do make a difference, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for what you do, man. And like
Yeah.
I said, you stepped up and created something that might actually push us across the finish line. So thanks for doing that.
Yeah, it's time for us all to step up now, and we'll do it.
Well said. All right, Brian, all your information will be in the show notes for PMHC. And we're looking forward to hearing from you again soon in the future.
Thank you so much.
All right. Awesome. Well, thanks again to Brian and the rest of the volunteers at the Pilot Mental Health Campaign for all of the hard work they're doing. You mentioned in the episode, Max, that the 21.5 show was going to make a donation, which we have. And we encourage all of our listeners to step up if they can. We'll have a link in the show notes where you can easily go. They have easy payment options online, I think Google Pay and credit card. So join us in supporting them. It's a credit card. I mean, does it even count, Max?
Yeah, like Ted used to say in college, it's just fake money. It's not real money. It's credit card money. It's not real money.
It's credit card, yeah. Yeah.
But Brian has stepped up to the plate. This is a nonprofit. He is not being paid, and he's doing the good work to fix this problem. So, like I said in the interview, I really commend him. It's impressive. We needed somebody like him to step up that actually knows how to navigate this, and I think this is it. I got a good feeling about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Shout out, of course, as we mentioned, to Maddie and Emma at the Pilots Pandemic podcast. If you want to dive in more on this topic, they are covering all sorts of angles. We'll have a link in the show notes for that as well. If you're wondering where the rest of our episode is, the mailbag, flight advice, all of that, if you missed the announcement in the last episode, we're now breaking things up. So we're doing the mailbag and flight advice in one episode, and then the interview with the guest in the other episode. We're releasing them weekly here in 2024. So look for that to drop next week. All right. Until next week, Max.
Remember, making a donation to the Pilot Mental Health Campaign is the key to solving a pilot mental health crisis.
And flexibility is the key to air power.
Yeah, that too. Till next time.
See you guys.
The statements made in this show are our own opinions and do not reflect, nor were they under any direction from any of our employers.